Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Stani Kulechov, who is the founder of Aave and Lens Protocol. Stani's been a builder for years in the Ethereum ecosystem, so we explore the value of constraints when building products, talk about how to create open, permissive contribution opportunities in DAOs. We dive into the role narratives play when building products, why we need Web3 social, and some of the economic and business models that could sustain it. We dive in a little bit into the Lens protocol, talking about how communities might utilize Lens. It's a fantastic episode, lots of tactical learnings and takeaways, so let's get into it. Stani, welcome to Club.
Thank you, Jess.
So there's so much we can get into here. I think most people know you from Aave. And so I'm super curious. Can you maybe just give us a bit of an introduction of how you describe what you do right now? Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm the founder and CEO of the Aave, the company that has been building for the past 6 years smart contract-based protocols. And one of the protocols we created very early was the Aave protocol, which is pretty much an application living on a blockchain where you can supply cryptographic assets and earn yield on them, and also use assets as a collateral and borrow liquidity. Essentially, if you have various different kinds of tokens and you don't want to sell them, you can borrow stable coins to finance a tuition, maybe buy a car or pay a mortgage. And the Aave protocol itself is securing roughly 15 billion worth of value at the moment. And it's part of the whole kind of like a decentralized finance space. And we at Aave, we're very much not only focusing on decentralized finance, but we're in larger sense Web3 builders. Since decentralized finance has emerged to quite a good extent now. And we also have seen the creator economy grow with the NFTs, and NFTs becoming more popular also in the mainstream. One of the things we wanted to focus next was the Web3 social and just build infrastructure on that space. And recently we launched into the mainnet the Lens protocol, which is a decentralized social graph, meaning where you can actually create a on-chain profile and also have your follow relationships on chain. So any social media developer, entrepreneur can actually build an application on top, and you don't lose as a user the data if one application goes down. Instead of you have continuity and ownership on your data and your relationship with your audience. So that's the kind of like a short resolution what we're doing and have been building.
I find myself very often on these conversations saying there's no shortage of things for us to get into. And I think that's very, very true here as well. I'm really fascinated with sort of original insights that sort of drive to big visions. And I wonder if you can maybe, even for Aave, like what was the original insight there that really sparked that sort of first wave of growth for you guys?
That's interesting. I think like the first part, whatever you're building or trying to start, is usually like the product itself. So you can build something technically very, very valuable, very good, and something that is really solving a important issue. But kind of like a second thing which you need to achieve is usually the network effect. So how do you create a community and find people that will use your protocol and actually kind of like share what they are using with their peers and create that network effect? So for Aave, kind of like our benefit has been that we were able to create a community very early, very small in the beginning, but we had a good feedback loop where every single kind of like a feedback that we received on the product side or on the community in Twitter and even early days in Reddit, we took that feedback and always were interacting with the community. And that kind of like helped us to grow the community and spread the network effect. And of course, having a narrative in what we're doing as well. So a product or a protocol is never final. And it also applies to software as well. So software is never kind of like a final and ready, but you need to think on how you iterate and build new versions and make it better and do frequent releases. And that has helped us to gain quite good network effect. And now the Aave protocol itself, it has been on the version 3, which was launched a couple of months ago, and it had quite significant improvements compared to the previous version in terms of capital efficiency and also regarding the security of the protocol itself. So with the kind of similar vision, we have been building the Lens protocol, But one important change has been that we built Lens protocol in a way where it's very easy to contribute to the protocol directly, plus build different kinds of modules. So the protocol itself is very modularized. You have different kinds of follow modules, so you can create different kinds of logics like pay to follow and share the collection fees of content NFT collection with the follower audience, and you can innovate further as a developer. So it's kind of like a mindset that you have to have all the time, that when you build something, you don't want to build it complete. Instead, you want to build in as open form as possible and leave a lot of space for the community members to come and build it together with you.
I think one of the challenges that comes up, like I totally agree with that. The challenge that comes up is that, without some constraints, we have a really hard time making progress. So I'm curious how you guys thought about constraints, or how you think about constraints as a part of trying to create that open, permissive contribution opportunity.
Wow, that's a good question. I would say there's always constraints when you are working with the blockchain. So also in smart contract level, for example, how you build a protocol, you have always limitations what you can use in terms of per one block basis and consume gas as well. So there's different kinds of technical limitations, of course, but you always have different kinds of resource limitations. Maybe you have only, let's say, 1 year or 2 years to build and achieve a network effect, which is very scary for many entrepreneurs, especially because some products might take years actually to get a good network effect. And just to give a good example, I think in Web3, the network effects doesn't need to happen overnight or even like within a year or two. There's plenty of good examples where we've seen protocols and projects start very early and they build that network effect over years. A good example is for example, POAP. So basically when you go to different kinds of events, you get a POAP, which is the proof of attendance of a particular event, and anyone can actually create one. So the fascinating part here is that that project started just by one person, Patricio, giving those POAPs in early events, and over the years kind of like a
Literally
expanded.
giving you like a badge in a conference and also getting you to claim the POAP. I just love the early story of POAP.
Exactly. So like I would say like you never need to think of going kind of like an all open boards in the way that you need to get as much as possible users in your protocol or in your product. I think it's more of a kind of like a reverse approach where you should build slowly, build one feature at a time, onboard one user at a time, explain what you're building one person at a time. And this approach generates kind of like a more stronger value, whatever you're doing. And because things on chain live theoretically forever, you have like all the time you need to build things.
Yeah, I love that. So almost like the process of which you go through building product, very natural constraints, and that you're building for not for a general population, but for a specific user that's informing your sort of advancements. It seems to me that
Yeah, exactly.
It seems to me that narrative is also a very big part of, if I think about the DeFi narrative and sort of on-chain lending, there's like a thing there. When we sort of maybe think about Lens and sort of this more recent thing that you're rolling out, I'm curious how you see the role of narrative in how you shape products and bring those early users around. And then I'm sort of transitioning into like, why Web3 social? Like that's a thing I want to get to here as well.
Yeah, I mean, narratives is always part of whatever you do. So you basically want to create a story that is very interesting and also resonates to you and your audience. And also because later these protocols they become very scaled. So essentially the same way as something like IP or HTTP protocol are used by billions of people directly and indirectly. I believe that Web3 protocols will be scaled in the same volume. For me, narratives is important because we'll always go back in time and look kind of like what happens in terms of history and also try to learn from those narratives and stories and build new kind of stories. But especially important it is because it helps you navigate what kind of culture you build around your community and your product itself. So, for example, with the Lens protocol, how we started onboarding profile creation was that we simply had an open letter where anyone can come actually sign the letter for manifesting the future of Web3 social, where we had certain type of values that we wanted to highlight, mainly ownership of your content, your profile, your communication channel with your audience, and also kind of like an open permissionless systems in general and decentralization. So those values were very important to us, and we had in the beginning roughly almost 50,000 signers, and then we started to participate in create hackathons. So we had a Grow hackathon together with the global team, and we had over 500 130 hackers with over 130 submissions, which basically leads to the next thing that when we actually we deployed the protocol into the mainnet and started to open the profile creation, the first profile creators were those who signed the open letters, people who participate in hackathons, and then different DAOs that are very much related to content or kind of like embracing decentralization and user ownership. And I think it's just kind of like very important because this is the way where you could actually build a bit the culture around the product before you scale, because we always go back in time and think about like how different products created. For example, Instagram, as the very beginning and still is, it's basically a place to show highlights from your life. And TikTok, for example, it has been always about rewarding creators of coming up with extremely entertaining content. And it still has that kind of like momentum from the early. So the narrative always stays, and it's very difficult to change on the later time period.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting constraint that, well, it's going to exist no matter what. And so purposefully engaging in the shaping of that is essential and also does evolve quite a bit. But I think that is interesting in how embedded those narratives are in from day one. And I think as founders or project leaders, you can sort of be ignorant of that fact, right? You're sort of just doing and doing and doing, and the sort of narrative sort of is evolving. You know, if you're pitching people, you kind of get that narrative evolving, you get real-time feedback, and then all of a sudden you're out in the world, kind of has a life of its own, but all of it traces back to the DNA of some of those really early insights that were generated and communicated.
Yeah, and Jess, I think the pitching part is very good way to cement your narrative, because when you're talking about your product to your peers, it doesn't need to be actually a funding pitch. It can be anything you explain to your friends, your family, and then on a kind of like a wider scale also for fundraising. So essentially that at that point you kind of like, and especially when you have the discourse, so the pitching is in two ways. So you get the feedback and you can talk through those topics. You actually start to cement like what is important in what you're building, and then what kind of user groups are actually this solution could affect, and the culture you want to build and affect. So definitely that helps you quite a lot.
That's interesting. So I'm curious, like, what is your succinct answer to why we need Web3 social?
I think there is multiple solutions. For me, essentially, the main important part is that today we're relying quite a lot in platforms, and essentially where we, the users, we're creating a lot of data, we're creating a lot of interactions, and we're the consumers of many of the Web2 social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and so on. The kind of like a challenge here is that end of the day, what we're doing, we're also feeding a lot of data for these platforms and the companies to actually then figure out what we could buy. So we, the users, are the product of the legacy social media platforms. And what Web3 Social is trying to achieve is switching this model completely upside down. So essentially, when you as a user, you own data, so you own your access to your profile and you have the ownership of the profile, you have the access to distribute content to your followers, and they have a permissionless way to see your content. What happens is that you are not anymore a number in a database that can be controlled, but essentially it changes the dynamics in a way where all these applications, they have to start to actually compete on bringing you the best experiences for you. So they have to create a better experience layer that is targeting and realizing that you are the epicenter of the relationship, and also more better algorithms. And by better, I mean algorithms that are fitting you the most. So for example, if you are interested in exploring more content, you should have an algorithm and using an algorithm where you see more interesting content for you. Or maybe if you are using too much social media, maybe the algorithm should actually figure a way to turn and shut down the usage from you if you overconsume, for example. It just changes the way we think about social completely today.
Yeah, that's sort of the sense, and I'm really interested in exploring that. Recently, I saw that you were banned from Twitter very briefly for what looks like a mistake. I'm curious how, at least like the question of the day, which is really around moderation and like how do we create safe spaces, and is that what we should be doing, or is it free speech? And I sort of noticed in your answer that the way that we've seen, say, Web3 social come up in the past has really been around this immutability, or at least the ability not to be censored or platform, free speech sort of argument. Notice that was sort of absent from your answer there, but I'm curious, how are you thinking about what could really be a fairly large minefield, I think, to step into as building a product that is, I mean, this is the front lines of the culture war right now. It's happening on social media. And from the outside, it might look kind of crazy that you want to pop your head up in the middle of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, there's culture war, there's information war, there's kind of like a lot of competing and saturating narratives going on at the same time. And for me, the Twitter ban was essentially, I mean, for the background, so Elon Musk wanted to buy and still wants to buy Twitter, hopefully. And essentially, one of the kind of like a back ideas there was that he was embracing freedom of speech. So I was pretty much joking around and stating that I'm the new interim CEO of Twitter, and it became very viral for some reason. And then I stated a roadmap of 90 days where I suggested to ship the edit button within 1 week, support Ethereum and ENS, and integrate with the Lens protocol. And next morning when I was waking up, I heard that I was actually banned from Twitter. And this created this whole hashtag free Stani movement. And I think after almost a day, they unsuspended me. So when I was back, I manifested again that I'm back as an interim CEO of Twitter. So it just showcases that what is freedom of speech is an important right, but also what's hard about it is that there's always competing rights at the same time, and also who is deciding what is basically right and wrong. So the kind of like a more bigger lesson here is that in a platform like Twitter, you have to focus on the idea where Twitter decides basically what is right and wrong based on their judgment. So who gets the blue check mark? If someone has blue check mark, is the information more accurate? But everything is pretty much on Twitter's discretion. But in open social networks, the idea is that actually, you have a protocol, you own the data, and you have your followers, but essentially all the applications, they curate and they moderate, and you can even build middlewares where you have content moderations and you have competing content moderation protocols. So you have a lot of layers and social verification where actually you're not bound anymore by one particular algorithm or company, but they are competing on actually coming up with results and moderation that is the most sound. And this is the kind of like a big shift from the old to new one, because well, the old is you're stuck in an algorithm, you're stuck in a platform. If you leave, you will lose your followers. If Twitter changes their terms and conditions, you will leave. Because of that, you will leave your followers as well. And it's up to them to basically decide how their platform works. But in a open system, it's anyone can come in and build something new. And it doesn't need to be a big company. That might be just some smart person in a college campus creating just a better algorithm that just is more humane even and creates more happier users.
That idea of like transparency and understanding where you stand just seems like a huge miss in the existing structure. And I also think this whole discussion around how many bots are on Twitter, is it 5%, is it 20%, I think is really quite fascinating, because like on one end, either they don't want to get that detail, or on the other, they don't have the tools to go get it. And like in both, the solution is probably more accessibility, transparency, and there's very smart people out there who I'm sure would come up with novel approaches to identify that problem and many others, but you're sort of like locking that into an organization, yes, but also these products are so driven by the cultures of those organizations. And I think that is a big thing at Twitter, not for us to get into a conversation about Twitter here, but I think that's that transparency and like the idea of being able to sort of try on different recipes essentially that are going to help me identify new topics. And I think there are like a lot of folks' response to this idea of filter bubbles is to try to like, I don't want to be in filter bubbles. I'm without a doubt in a big one and probably many small ones, but I think I would definitely choose to have more diverse content in my stream if I was given that option. And the reality is I just don't have that option right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like the power of Web3 is the idea that you have always the freedom of choosing something. For example, if you take an example of networks or decentralized finance compared to the traditional finance system, like it's very hard to fork a bank and just like choose a new community and serve a new community with better financial services or better risk management. But in decentralized finance, you can actually do that, because the big difference here is that essentially you can always fork the code base, create a new community, and start from completely zero with a new aspect. And same with the social. It's very hard today, for example, to fork something like Twitter, the platform, and create something new if you are not satisfied on how they culture, the way they process, let's say, complaints and so forth. So this is the beauty of the Web3. You always have the risk of working. So you want to have a very wide consensus as well.
So the business model of Web2 social networks is essentially aggregation of eyeballs and demand and sort of selling that off to advertisers. It sounds in this new model, that type of business model doesn't quite fit. So I'm curious, what is the economic model that you see really thriving or sustaining both Lens and maybe like the broader ecosystem of applications that get built on it?
Yeah, I think like definitely like advertisement is not my choice of monetization. I mean, I think I want to be exposed to things that I really like and I want to support. So I don't mind, for example, a creator sharing other creators' content that is something that's very interesting to me. And for example, if I like certain type of music, let's say I like organic house music. So I like organic house music, and there is one artist I particularly like a lot. And there is a collaboration between another artist. Let's say they drop their album on Lens Protocol, and there's some sort of fee sharing there. I definitely see that as a fine option, and I'm happy to pay for that for consuming the content. So there is like different kinds of layers to that. But for example, because it's an open protocol, you pretty much can create any kind of alternative way to monetize. We have tried to keep it very narrow in the sense that we try to only solve one part of the social media aspect, and that's the social graph. But we build into a couple of interesting monetization models. And one is that the way the Lens protocol works is that every content is actually a dynamic NFT. So your follow NFTs, they will always reflect the latest content that you post. Now, if I, as a user, if I'm very interested in that content and I like it a lot, so let's say there is some interesting new song that has been dropped on Lens Protocol, I can actually collect that content as individual NFT, and the creator can actually set different kinds of rules. For example, it can be an open edition, time-based, limited edition for, let's say, followers from token ID 1 to 100, and maybe a collection fee there. Or you can create a completely custom module where it's auction-based collection and only one person can collect it. So typical NFT auctioning content collection. The second thing what you can create is that if you like some particular content, you can amplify that content to your own followers. And this is kind of like, we call it mirroring. And it's kind of similar where you would monetize the retweet button of Twitter. So those are the two interesting things. I've seen a third one where one team built in a hackathon, a kind of a way where if you have a follower base, you can just set a fee to anyone to actually send you a content. And if you approve, you can share that with your audience, kind of like sponsored content as well. It's more like Web2 native is something that we have seen. But I think collection of NFTs and amplifying those are the ones that we have created as a default. But I think that's a topic where we will see pretty much a lot of innovation in the future.
So this sounds like good constraints to get rolling with, but I think, yeah, that intuition is probably right. There will be more interesting things that folks will come up with. I mean, collecting NFTs wasn't really a thing until last year and a half or so. So imagine what other sort of things come out from it. I'm curious about how you're thinking about the Lens protocol specifically. What is the economic model there? Is there sort of a vision? I mean, this is maybe the when token talk as well. How are you thinking about sustainability and protocols?
Yeah, for now, we basically build the protocol for the community to enjoy, and we kind of want to see if it actually takes off and creates protocol market fit and creates a bigger community. The cool part is that with those collection modules and also the mirroring modules, there is a in-protocol fee collection as well that goes to a common reserve. Those fees are set to 0 now, so they're not activated, but it's something where if the protocol goes to the community, that is something that can be set, and the protocol can collect treasury, give grants, and do similar kind of like efforts that many of the DAOs have been doing these days. So it's for us like kind of like more of a progressive approach, and we want to see first that there is a lot of adoption before there is more of like a community ownership. But if there will be adoption, that will be the logical next step.
Do you have opinions on this hyperstructure idea that Jacob Horn's sort of been pushing forward? It sounds like you may have been building towards that, the idea of like there being a threat of fee and maybe the threat being the actual important part, not actually having a fee associated in with it.
Yeah, so for me, like I think fees are very valuable for DAOs. And for example, we've seen a lot of DAOs are bootstrapping their treasury with native token and then swapping it to some more kind of like a stable assets. And I think it's just very like economically, it makes a lot of sense to have fees-based structure. And the reason is there that it also means that you basically have cash flow that you can use as a DAO and refund different kinds of functions that you actually need and kind of like sustain the building of the protocol. And I think Aave is a very good example as a protocol and as a DAO where it's roughly collecting from from 30 to 40 to 50 million, depending on the evaluations, annually million worth of fees, which means that there can be different kinds of service providers that are providing auditing services, development services, and also different spin-off DAOs. Like we have the grants DAO, probably have a risk DAO as well. So they all provide services to the DAO, and it creates a sustainable mechanism. And I think this same model will probably kind of like go into other fields like Web3 social, many of the NFT DAOs. And there is nothing wrong in having fees, in my opinion, that go to the DAO treasury, because that just leads towards more sustainable DAO business models.
Yeah, to me, that last part is the essential piece, right? That those fees are going to a collective treasury versus going to a private builder whatsoever. And I think we see experiments or utility in both, I guess. But I think long term, those are the things that are going to get, because like underneath this whole idea of building protocols, and I think right back to the early days of Twitter, right? Like it was the young guys and girls that were building on top of it. There was tweet decks and there was these little things that were done. And then probably rightfully so from like a business model perspective for Twitter, they like really pulled that out and really, I mean, they rugged the devs in a very real way.
True. And I remember,
Yeah.
I mean, I used to build applications on top of Twitter, because Twitter was one of the early kind of like success applications built on Ruby on Rails in the early days. So definitely there was a good developer activity there, because also they're using underlying technology that was kind of like giving them network effects, the same way as Ethereum is giving network effects, or let's say Polygon, or whatever you're using to build on top. And we could even think about it this way. So how will the internet look like if part of every single internet transaction payment will go to some sort of a collective which funds things to be built or applications or whatnot on top of the internet? I could even say that internet will be the biggest state, or not even state, but actually the biggest collective out there, and could actually fund nations because of the kind of like a big massive cash flow.
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. You get me distracted here, Stanley, because
Oh,
I
sorry.
have so many things to get into. I love it though. But like we speak to in our community is folks that are really building community tokens, community projects, community owned organizations. And, I think there's this assumption, I think that, the tech stack that we're building on right now is just kind of messed up. If you've been on Discord or, even on Twitter, like so much of the value is actually created there. And yet, the core principles that I think that we hold to be really important, which is sort of say a voice, maybe exit, the ability to have governance and ownership in these networks isn't there. So my sense is that there's a big opportunity for communities to engage and build within the Lens protocol. And I'm curious if you have sort of some thoughts or insights or requests for products. How might an organization like Seed Club or the 53 projects that we have the pleasure of supporting be using Lens in maybe the near future or distant future?
Wow, yeah. So Lens protocol itself is very developer friendly protocol. And even if you want to directly contribute to the smart contract base, or just use it whatever you want to build and make it Web3 social. So, and there's definitely like a big application layer that you can build. So one of the things I would love to see is new ways of interacting with the content. And just to give an example how quick and fast it is to build on top of the Lens protocol, there is one front end which is called Lenster, and it was built within a under 2 week hackathon, and it's very popular now, especially because we have a shared middleware that we're using, the Lens API, and the idea is that it helps to bootstrap building faster the applications and just experience with the creating interesting new applications. But also, like, if you think about, like, there's sort of applications that we use on a daily basis, like Discord, that is interesting because you create a Discord server and you have users, and there's no kind of like a Web3 data there because everything is running on servers end of the day. But I could definitely see, like, instead of asking people going to Discord, you might go to actually Lens protocol. Everyone who follows the handle that you create, the profile that you create, that's on-chain data. It's easy to use and reward, and there's building governances already. It's just like vertically, horizontally, there's many things to build. And also what's fascinating is that you don't need to recreate the whole network effect. So today, if you build a new social media application, you need to kind of like get a big network effect, that platform effect, and focus on growth hacking. But here, like, if you build something very, very fascinating and something that drives a lot of interest, all these Lens profiles, there's 10,000 Lens profiles created within 1 week, and it's very limited scope of that is opening up in the whole protocol. But thinking of the future, for example, the users just need to click and log in to your application by connecting their wallet, and you have the whole Lens user base there. So that's a enormous network effect, especially because they all are Web3 users. So it's a perfect combination for everything.
Do you see, is there a risk? I mean, the adage, I think, in startup worlds and online world is this idea of like there's two business models, right? Bundling and unbundling, right? And we're just going back and forth between these. Is there a risk? I mean, we see such centralization in media generally, like across the board. Do you see that as a risk and or how might you be able to sort of combat that in this Web3 social world?
Yeah, I think there's always everywhere kind of like a risk of centralization because of the human nature that we tend to trust very frequently. So we trust that, we go outside during the night and there is lights on the street. We trust that the traffic lights are working, and it's very natural for humans to do so. And the idea of decentralization is that, you kind of like try to limit the trust and have less of centralization. So you have to have this like constant awareness why we're doing this, why we are decentralizing the infrastructure, the application infrastructure, and also the way we decide on different topics and matters. I think essentially you always will have this risk of centralization. As an example, the E2.0 staking, where Lido protocol staking was actually kind of like one of the biggest market shares of staking as a service. And that shows that actually like might happen anywhere. It might happen just one particular middleware becomes popular. Let's say the Lens API becomes popular. We need more APIs. We need to decentralize that part, or something else becomes too centralized. That can be even, let's say, token ownership in small communities, and also social capital, which is usually something that isn't on chain. But if someone has a valuable opinion, and that might direct the voting and the human behavior. So that risk is always there, and we just need to find ways how we be aware and always think of how we can mitigate those risks.
Maybe changing tacks a little bit here, because I think one of the things that people sort of describe you as an incredible builder in this space, and I think in just our conversation here today, I've sort of seen a lot more depth in how you think about some of these really big topics, which has been great to see and has got me thinking about a lot of things. I'm somewhat familiar with sort of your early start and sort of where you got to today. And I think that a big topic that's coming up in our community is this idea of the bear market, like the building in a downturn, sort of managing through this stuff. My understanding, if I got it right, is that you've been through a few of these and maybe some of them have been more impactful on you as a builder than others. Like, I'm wondering, is there some insight or experience that you can share with us for people who are starting today or who have maybe raised some money or going to market in a time when the bloom is off the boom, as they like to say?
Yeah, definitely. Like, especially like in crypto, we have market cycles. So there is times when, you have an idea and everyone wants to fund it, no matter what stage it is. If it's just like something written on a piece of paper, you have a proof of concept, or you have just a few friends that are believing in an idea. In the bear market, it's different. So you basically might have an idea, but that's not enough. You might have to prove that you can build it because people are more cautious. It means that investors, community members, everyone is a bit risk averse, cutting spending, and just wants to be sure what they invest is something very valuable and the team can execute. And especially it's hard for the new entrepreneurs who are raising funds on the first time, because it means that it's way easier to raise once you have done something that is very functional, and even you sold a startup and so forth, or created a protocol and decentralized and you have a track record. So what it means is that actually I'll take it as a kind of like a positive way, where it's a time where you can actually solidify your idea and try to figure out like which parts are actually needs more work, talk about it a bit more, think about the idea more, and also build it a bit further and have something more tangible. I think that's the kind of way. And of course, like the golden rule usually is that, you should raise funds on a bull market and then build on a bear market, because there's also less noise. But the beauty of the bear market is that you have full focus on your product. There's not too many NFT drops pretty much like distracting on what you're doing. And I think that's the best thing. It's not very kind of like, it might be a bit of more sad cycle to work, but at the same time, it gives you a lot of freedom to focus on a product, and focus has its own price. So it's something you should learn to enjoy at least.
Yeah, I feel that. I just think about the C Club started in August 2020, and it's just been like pretty much a wild ride on the bull wave since then. But I love this framing the opportunity to get more clear and make more progress. And because I think there is, like, one of the challenges a lot of teams are going to face right now is having not had to do that work, having raised money. And now not only do they have to go still do the work of figuring out what that product market fit or the thing that people actually want, but they also have inflated expectations that may or may not fit the ultimate path that they go down. So it can lead to some other, I think the technical term is a mind fuck.
Yeah, and I think it's about going back to basics, because it's not enough to simply create a mysterious Twitter handle and change your PFP into NFT and then kind of like start something and you have funds flowing in. It's actually a time to learn, to be a real entrepreneur, to think about this idea, how do you monetize it, and just like bringing back sustainable economics and entrepreneurship and just like, of course, in a new Web3 form, but also like being very smart of what you're doing, understanding what is a burn rate, understanding that whoever you hire, that's a human being, and that there's salary, there's social cost, there's everything, and figuring out every single thing that is important in a company, because you're running a company or a DAO, whatever it is, end of the day, but there's always assets and liabilities and a product, and have to be strategic all the time. So I think it's also kind of like, and I think those entrepreneurs that really kind of like don't get distracted by the fact that there's like less interest, but are just focusing that how I will make this product work because I believe it solves a lot of problems and it's very usable, those will definitely survive.
Yeah, I love that. I think you sort of sit in a really interesting space, having a probably very different view of the market, the world out there than, say, maybe I do or some of our listeners. What are you excited about right now outside of your own projects? What's capturing your attention? What are you paying attention to or excited about?
I think I'm overly excited about DAOs in the sense that rethinking like what kind of other models there could be besides, one token, both ways to govern an organization, and also thinking about could there be a bit more structural organizations within DAOs instead of completely flat organizations. Also kind of like how you can create different kinds of combinations of DAOs. So that's something I'm very curious about at the moment, which is outside of like, obviously Aave is a DAO and whatnot, but also kind of like where we could go to the next level of creating organizations that are very valuable and could replace old functions that are outdated. And also like, I think there's sort of kind of like a big value proposition there, because we always focus on the products and protocols, but the DAO aspect and the governance is something that is you focus when you have done your product, or it's you don't have anything else at the moment, kind of like a critical to do. So I think that's also a big opportunity for anyone out there.
Yeah, and it's going back to an earlier part of our conversation where narrative is such an important part, and a lot of these sort of early DAO forms are very culturally governed, despite whatever the actual mechanism is. The idea of like kind of leaving that as an afterthought is probably a big missed opportunity for a lot of teams. And also there's so much of this is human beings, which is like not quite as straightforward as writing Solidity, which is not very straightforward as well. So I like that. Okay, I think there's probably a number of people here who would love to learn more about Lens Protocol. I think I am one of them who has claimed my username, but haven't really started to interact with the protocol or any of the applications on it. Where can you send us? What's the best place for us to sort of see what's happening at Lens and start kicking some tires?
Yeah, there's lens.xyz. So it has a lot of information about the protocol, how it works, different kind of functions. And if you want to see the Lens protocol live, you can go to one of the community front ends, for example, lenster.xyz. So Lenster. And Lenster is interesting because that was built by a community member in a hackathon and still maintained on the side of his real daytime job. And of course, you can reach me out on Twitter if you want to chat about Lens Protocol and build something cool, and hopefully see you all on Lens Protocol.
Well, I'm looking forward to you assuming your natural next role as CEO of Twitter, if or when the deal goes through. I think it's a fascinating exploration, and I appreciate just the thoughtfulness and how you've articulated both the product and sort of your approach. Appreciate you spending the time, Stani, and stoked to see what's next for Lens.
Thank you, Jess, for having me. It was a pleasure.